Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today in Kiev, our guest is John Sweeney. John Sweeney is a book author. He's a British person who lives in Kiev, who wrote 15 books. The last ones are Killer in the Kremlin and Putin's Prisoner. And we will talk with John today about what impact the Russians' invasion on Ukraine had on this country. Thank you for having found time for this talk.
Pleasure, Sahi.
So tell me, you have visited the liberated regions in the south of Ukraine, which the Ukrainian army has liberated after months of the Russian invasion. What have you seen there?
Evidence of war crimes on repeat, evidence of war crimes again and again and again. In particular, indiscriminate shelling by artillery of civilian areas. This is kind of horribly well testified. Torture on an industrial scale, and also use of weapons which are banned against civilians according to the rules of war, according to the Geneva Convention. And specifically, I'm talking about what we call white phosphorus, and the Ukrainians call lustrate. This is very hot incendiary weapons. There is a classical military use for them, which is to mask when you're moving a lot of soldiers. You put this up in the sky, and it masks movements. So that's the legitimate use for it. It is wrong and against the rules of war to use this against civilian targets, against people's houses. So we saw powerful evidence in Kherson of the use of this white phosphorus stuff, whatever you call it, very, very hot stuff, and it set on fire. We saw video of the place being set on fire, and we went there, been burnt down, and we got powerful civilian testimony according to that. Torture, the evidence is compelling. The Russians use torture on an industrial basis. And the thing is, I first came across this 23 years ago when I went to Chechnya. And that's the first time when I called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. What you've got is a system, an army, the Russian army, that uses barbarity as part of its strategy.
So it's about breaking deliberately centralized ordered usage of torture to break the will of population.
Yes, so the Americans rightly got into trouble for torturing people in Abu Ghraib. This was not planned from the White House. This was bad actors inside the American army who had grown too powerful. There wasn't enough proper supervision, and they captured Iraqis. This was bad. This happens in all armies. The British, to our shame, did some of this stuff in the Second World War. Nothing like as bad as the Nazis. I'm sure that there will be some Ukrainians, soldiers who, angry that they've lost their friends, their loved ones, will also have treated Russian prisoners of war badly. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But the general rule, I think, both, for example, the British during the Second World War and the Ukrainians now, is that more or less the people, the British then, the Ukrainians now respect the rules of war. The Russians do not at all from the top. So one of the things I came across when I when I worked with the BBC in 2000, I made a radio documentary called Victims of the Torture Train. Back then, it won an Amnesty Prize. I know amnesty is now a controversial thing, but it was different back then. And it was about the Russians' use of torture, the use of electric shock against people. They'd be tied up and you'd put clips on fingers and toes and other parts of the body. Again, this has happened in Kherson, and we met somebody who'd suffered electricity. But also we saw evidence of what is called the slon. Now, the slon is Russian for elephant. It's the gas mask, and there is a corrugated snout to the gas mask which leads to the filter. So if you wear it, it looks like an elephant. And what the Russians do is they handcuff your hands behind your back, they put this thing on, they take off the filter, and they can, all you have to do is hold the snout and the person stops breathing. Or you can put water down it. And in a abandoned torture place used by the Russians against Ukrainians underneath the main police station in Kherson, we found these gas masks. So, and I couldn't find a witness, partly because of the chaos, because remember, the whole time we're in Kherson, Kherson is being shelled by Russian artillery indiscriminately. So, but nevertheless, I know that there are Ukrainian prisoners of war who've given evidence to the Ukrainian police that they have been victims of the Slon in other places, for example, Izium. So what we're looking at in broad brush is a system of barbarity from the top, where virtually everybody you come across who's been in Russian captivity has been tortured. And the torture is about enforcing Russian power. It's not about intelligence gathering. There's somebody who was captured near Kupiansk. He told me, which is very far in the east, but I interviewed him in October, and he told me that they asked, which country are you in? Ukraine, says the guy. So they whack up the voltage. Which country? This isn't about intelligence gathering. This is about oppression, but it's oppression through torture. So as far as the Kremlin sees it, torture is an entirely legitimate method of war, along with artillery, along with using guns, landmines, etc., etc. But there is something barbaric about this. And this is my great frustration, is that the Western leaders who are, it seems, by not giving enough war materials to Ukraine to help them to defeat the Russian enemy, they are effectively suggesting in their minds, or that their logic rests on this assumption, that Vladimir Putin is a rational actor and that Vladimir Putin is a reliable negotiator. So if you do a deal with him, he will respect the deal, and that you can do some kind of a deal with Vladimir Putin. And that is to ignore the reality of his personality, his psychology, his history. He is a war criminal. He is a serial killer. And he's utterly, utterly untrustworthy. So when you come across somebody like this in real life, in ordinary life, you call the police. You don't say, hey, listen, mate, okay, I'll, you can have my car, you can have my house, you can have my wife, you can have my children, just leave me alone. No, you don't do that. Not with somebody like this. You say, fuck off. I'm calling the cops right now. And the problem is that he has somehow managed, through force of his terrifying psychotic personality, to intimidate all of our Western leaders. And the evidence for that is they are not giving in a timely fashion what Ukraine needs to win this war.
That is a very strong statement by John Sweeney, who was witness of what Russians have left in occupied region, have been liberated by Ukrainian army. He entered Russian torture chambers. He spoke to victims of Russian torture, and he knows what is going in Ukraine amid the Russian full-scale invasion. Subscribe this channel, like, share, leave your comments in commentary section, and we go further with the talk to John Sweeney. So, John, tell me, you have started to investigate Russian war crimes already in Chechnya. It was middle 90s, end of the 90s.
2000.
And we know that what happened in Chechnya, the Russian army and Russian police massively used torture in Chechnya, also rape, to break the will of local population. And then they came back to Russia and spread and sophisticated these torture techniques in the police stations. We know what happened in Russia in the police stations where tortures have been used massively and was tolerated by the supervisors. So now you say that the Russian army needs much more troops than it was in Chechnya ever. Like you speak about hundreds of thousands of soldiers Russia used in Ukraine. They are all ordered to torture, to rape, to kill.
There isn't any, there is little evidence of them being ordered, but it is understood. So there is no order to torture, to rape, to kill civilians that we've seen, that we know about from the Kremlin, but this is understood as as the way Russia fights the war. But the other thing that's happened is a society, an army is a mirror to the society it comes from. I promise you, if you hang out with the British Army, you'll hear some awful jokes and you'll get tea and the food is bad. Like it just does in British society. But essentially, it's a civilized army. I've worked alongside it in places like Bosnia and Iraq. And although you can argue about the policies of what the British Army was doing there, in particular in Iraq, and I understand and sympathize with those arguments, the way the army conducts itself was more or less reflected British society. There is a problem with Russian society in that I think that after the Second World War, the West Germans at least had a serious go at denazifying. It wasn't perfect, I understand that, but they had a go. And that was at least the sense of what the new Germany was about. And it worked, more or less, it worked. Modern Germany is not Nazi Germany, full stop. The problem in Russia there was never an effective de-stalinization program. Just the other day, the Russians have put up a new statue in the town of Pskov. Yeah, which is on the, and I've been there. I spent some time there doing a story about Russian mafia corruption. Which what they did was they made bootleg hand cleaners, alcohol-based stuff that you could clean your hands with, and essentially it was made so people could drink it in lieu of alcohol because they just boosted the price of alcohol. And the problem is the marker they put into this stuff to make sure that people wouldn't drink it had a toxic, there's a combination, a cocktail effect, and it killed thousands. And of course the people who did this, you can be pretty sure they got away with it. Because, I mean, the people at the top. So there is a problem with Russian society, and it got worse and worse and worse under Putin, which is he's eroded the rule of law. He's eroded civil society. Journalists like us, we fall out of windows. We drink the wrong kind of tea. We can get shot.
But that is an essential problem. You said already that the Western politicians believed or wanted.
Still want to believe. Still, because you can see by their actions that what they're doing is they're trying to give, this phrase keeps on coming up, they're trying to give Vladimir Putin an off-ramp. They're trying to find a solution to the end of the war, which doesn't mean we've got to give Ukraine everything they need now for complete victory.
But that is a problem. When the German politicians didn't want to believe first that Russia is capable to devastatingly, indiscriminately bomb civilian areas in the early this war. But then the German Chancellor, the German Foreign Minister, many German ministers, deputies came to Ukraine. They saw how Bucha looked like. They saw how Irpin looked like. They went to Kharkiv, where millions city has been indiscriminately bombed with all possible types of ammunition, including cluster bombs.
Yes.
And still they say no, Ukraine may not attack military targets on the sovereign territory of Russia using German weapons. What is the reason for that?
Whether they're afraid of nuclear escalation. But of course, what Putin does is that Putin is gaming them. He's saying to them, you let the Ukrainians fire German missiles at Russia, and then I will resort to nuclear weapons. This is a threat from a bully. The reality is the Chinese have said to Putin, do not use nuclear weapons. The Chinese are worried about their economy. They have a problem with deflation. They have a problem with their property. Sales of Chinese houses and flats are dropping, tanking. They're having to blow up Chinese blocks of flats. There's a real problem with that part of the Chinese economy. Effectively, they've made the same mistake that the West did in 2007 with the Lehman Brothers crisis. They have a similar crisis, but because it's an authoritarian state, maybe a totalitarian state, they are seeking to hide the evidence of that, not very well. Number two, they had a terrible drought, a continuing terrible drought. One of the tributaries of the Yangtze last year was bone dry. This problem continues. And so they have an energy problem as well because they're losing hydroelectric power. Number three, their vaccine wasn't any good. One of the reasons why their vaccine wasn't any good is like people like me and you don't exist properly in China. If you report, oh, this vaccine doesn't work properly, the Western vaccines are better, you get locked up. And if you're smart, you just don't try. So China is afraid of an economic downturn, and the thing that would kill the world economy is Russia using nuclear weapons. So the Chinese have said very, very clearly, and the first person who said it was last September, was the deputy head of mission at the Chinese UN, then the foreign minister, and then Chairman Xi said it himself at a Tyrants Are Us meeting in Samarkand or somewhere like this. So the Chinese have said to Russia, don't use nukes, and therefore I don't think they will use tactical nuclear weapons. I think it's quite possible that down the track, in particular, if the Russians start losing lots and lots of land, they will blow up the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station and blame it on the Ukrainians.
Exactly, that is exactly what they already prepared for. They have
Yes.
reminded. But this is, I think, it's very important thing. Like you said already, that Putin is playing with the Western politicians, and you said also that Putin is a person who enjoys or uses violence. You studied Vladimir Putin and his actions and his way of thinking. Do you think that he understood at some level of his career that violence and sadism is a way of governing people, at least in Russia?
So it starts in his very early childhood. I spoke to, for my book, Killer in the Kremlin, I spoke to two psychiatrists, one Ukrainian, one American. And they both believe that he's a psychopath. And he's got all the traits. I mean, every red warning light flashes brightly. He is a pitiless human being. There is no pity in him whatsoever. He can lie so smoothly. When he lies, there is no sense of shame.
Yeah, exactly. We remember his interviews early his years in power when he said freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of demonstrations, pluralism in political parties. I will never go to the third term as a president, never violate the constitution. That's all what he said.
So the most significant act, or rather the first significant act, was the Moscow apartment bombs in September 1999, when he's prime minister. Remember, he's the former head of the KGB, new name FSB. And the evidence is absolutely compelling, and I set it out in Killer in the Kremlin, that he blew up Russia. 300 Russians were killed.
And that was so terrifying. Nobody could believe that the president or the FSB chief can order to kill hundreds of innocent people in his own capital.
Yes, but he did that. He did that. And the West knew about it. For example, I may say this, that in March 2000, I wrote a story for my then newspaper, The Observer, and I made a film for Channel 4 in Britain, setting out the evidence of two things. One, that it was the KGB, FSB that blew up Russia, that blew up the Moscow apartment bombs in September '99. And secondly, that Russia was committing war crime after war crime after war crime in Chechnya. The evidence was clear. Bush II and Blair went out of their way not to examine or deal with that evidence. They kept on giving him the benefit of the doubt. Then 9/11 happens. And this is the great strategic mistake that the West made, was that Blair and Bush did exactly what Osama bin Laden wanted them to do. They overreacted. And I think it's entirely right for the West to say to the Taliban, you are hosting our enemy here, Al-Qaeda. You've got to get rid of them, you've got to hand them over, or we're coming in. And the Taliban didn't react correctly, and therefore going after Al-Qaeda was entirely legitimate. But to then go into Iraq on the same logic was wrong, because Saddam was not part of 9/11. But what we ended up doing was we put fear of radical Islam ahead of fear of Russian and Chinese tyranny. And we were mistaken. It's a great mistake.
How all the faculties with Russian language, Slavic studies have been closed, and everyone in every intelligence service started to learn Arabic.
Yeah, and so now, by the way, I'm not underrating. I'm not undervaluing the threat from radical Islam in Afghanistan, Pakistan. Sorry, I've been rocketed by the Taliban 7 times. I get it, but let's not overstate it. What we ended up doing was giving Vladimir Putin a bunch of favors, which were wrong, because he is our enemy too. The enemy of my enemy is also my enemy. And actually, this one, Vladimir Putin's Russia, was a bigger enemy, is a bigger enemy, and will be a bigger enemy than radical Islam. Full stop. And so they got that wrong. There is something else as well. There is money. Dark Russian gold. Dark Russian gold actually in itself, and also through Russian oil and gas. Effectively, Vladimir Putin's psychotic and psychopathic character frightens political leaders in the West, but also the oil and gas were nice and cheap. And so what Germany did was they enjoyed years and years and years of cheap Russian oil and gas. Beautiful. And in London, we created Londongrad, where the profits of this dark trade were hidden in a set of bank vaults so dark and impenetrable to this day. Nobody knows where Vladimir Putin's money is properly. So what's happened is that Russia has created a poison factory, and this poison factory has poisoned really quite a lot of the Western world. And I think that dark Russian money helped pay for Trump become elected in 2016, and it helped pay for Brexit. And now I can't prove that, but yesterday an American FBI officer who'd retired was found guilty and sentenced to helping the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska evade an investigation by the FBI into him. So Deripaska's people got to an a retired FBI man, so that he could undermine the FBI investigation into him. Now, if they can do that to the FBI in New York, what can't they do in London or Berlin? So the big picture here is we are at war with Russia. The West is at war with Russia. It's just we don't know that. Question is, and this comes from a great friend of mine, Chris Donnelly, who was the former advisor on Russia to 4 NATO Secretaries General. The question is, how well are we doing at this war? We don't know we're fighting. And the answer is badly. And what's happening now is our Ukrainian allies, our friends, are fighting this war. And we're not fighting it, and there's a good logic for that, is that we don't want to go toe-to-toe with a nuclear power. I understand that. I'm not in favour of British or German or any other soldiers from Europe or America fighting the Russians directly. But the least we can do is give the Ukrainians the arms they need. And right now that means F-16s, it means rocket artillery, long-range rocket artillery to hit Russian bases where they're firing at Ukraine, perfectly legitimately according to the rules of war, and everything else they need. And we're not doing this in a timely fashion because our policy is we want Ukraine to survive very much. But we don't want Ukraine to win very much. And that's becoming more and more obvious. And we are not just failing the Ukrainians, we're now failing ourselves. We are endangering our own security by not helping Ukraine smash this monster once and for all.
Do we support Ukraine to the level it needs to win the war against Russia? Do we betray our own values? We are in talk with John Sweeney. He is an author of several books, including Killing the Kremlin and Putin's Prisoner. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel to see new interviews. Don't forget to like, to share, to write your comments. And we are going further to the forecast, what will go further in this war. So, John, you have told me already that the Russian society has severe problems with it. It has never been de-stalinized. It has no immunity against violence, using violence, humiliation, etc. Do you think that there can be some circles or some groups within the Russian society which could overthrow Vladimir Putin, stop this war, and bring Russia to some sort of normality, so we could start to believe that we can sign a treaty with Russia and Russia will not violate it next day?
I'm an optimist, and I think that it was very hard, and a lot of people were looking at, for example, Nazi Germany in 1945, and say January, February, March. What's going to happen afterwards? And there was a fear that after Hitler was overthrown, everything would be dark. What happened was, very quickly, a new Germany realized they had made a terrible mistake, and Germany became and is a civilized country once more. It's now part of the family of European countries. Good.
But let me question here. We know that Hitler ruled Germany only 12 years. Putin is already for 23 years in power. And Germany had different social groups like bureaucracy, businessmen, who were independent, more or less, and who could continue this tradition of Germany. In Russia, there was like only FSB or KGB. So
the problem is that you have had authoritarianism has been in Russia's bloodstream, in its memory, for centuries. And what happens is, under the Tsars, they enforce it with the Okhrana, security, with the Nauts, methods of torture, the Kosh, etc. In 1917, there is liberal government for 6 months, and then a new set of Tsars come along. They shoot all the nobles, but they keep the serfs. And to keep this system in place, the torturers come back, big time. And the torturers and the killers, the secret police, these are the people who now rule Russia. So there is a big problem with Russia in the way that Russian society is. It is not just Putin's war. The Russians are doing this. And they have a problem with their idea of what Russia should be, that Russia is some kind of great power. Well, actually, no. What it is, it has a big European population, yeah, and then this has this enormous hinterland. But the way it's been running it, the way Putin has been running it, you have to question whether it is right for this kind of Russian imperialism to continue. if it does what Putin's been doing. But I do think you get rid of Putin, then there is a chance and opportunity for Russia to change, and for them to start understanding and to be honest about their history, to be honest about the evil of Stalinism. So the question, I think, that haunts all of us is, who is worse, Hitler or Stalin? And the answer has to be Hitler was worse because the genocide against the Jews was a monstrous crime. But you can also argue that Stalinism was in some way less evil because it wasn't in particular against one racial group. However, it's lasted far longer, and it hasn't been properly taken apart and examined, and people have said, I used to work for Stalin, I am ashamed, we were wrong. Instead, modern Russia is putting up statues to Stalin. So there is a big problem there. However, you've also got to look at this. There are people in the West, if they take this narrative too much to heart, that Russia is so fucked up, then the danger is people in the West will start saying, you know what, let's stick with Putin. And I worry that right now, the true unarticulated policy of the West Wing of Joe Biden's administration is they prefer Russia under Putin than a chaotic future without Putin. And so what they're doing is they're slow walking the aid to Ukrainians. Now, you might argue that what they actually want is a victory for the Ukrainians on November the 5th next year, the day after the American presidential election, because then they're not running the election campaign against the backlog of chaos in Russia because Putin might have been deposed.
So you mean that in a case, like in that understanding in the US, that if Russia is being defeated before the election, there is a chance that some collapse starts, some bad things happen, and nobody knows what kind of bad things, like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, nothing bad happened. But if some bad things happen, then the Republicans can blame the Democrats for sparking chaos in Russia, and this will cost Biden the election.
Yes. So that, and Trump, I think, who is a creature of the Kremlin, and I can't prove the full nature of the relationship, but it feels like Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin's servant. He owes some kind of fealty to his master in the Kremlin, and that's not good. And he is, right now, the #1 contender to win the Republican nomination. How fucking scary is that? You know, it's terrifying. So I think the Americans are very afraid of that. The problem is, I think that's to understand the nature of the danger from Putin. I think that Putin's combination of psychopathic self-confidence, subtlety and intelligence makes him far more dangerous than any other future Russia.
And it seems that Vladimir Putin understands Russia very good. There is also saying that it's not Putin who has created modern Russia. It is Russia which created Putin as its leader.
I do not think this war would have happened without Vladimir Putin. However, Vladimir Putin having started the big war, it's also true as he's managed to convince an awful lot of Russians to kill and to rape and to castrate, and therefore there is also a problem with Russia today. And so just to say we get rid of Putin, that's the end of the problem, that's not true. At the same time, getting rid of Putin is a good thing, because that is the start of Russia beginning to understand the nature of its crimes and trying to address them.
What?
So the process has to be, you get rid of Putin. How do you get rid of Putin? The simple best way is for the Ukrainian army to defeat the Russian army, and in particular to kick the Russians out of Crimea.
What can help these Russians to realize that at least it is not in their interest to go further in this war. I don't say that they must understand that it is bad what they have done, but at least that it's not good for them. The Russians have already lost over 200,000 people, wounded or dead in Ukraine. It didn't help them. What could help?
So the problem is that the Russian people are being held captive by their government, and they're being fed lies on an industrial scale. I knew the Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who was great. She was poisoned then shot. I knew Natasha Esmerova. She was shot. I knew Boris Nemtsov, shot. Poisoned then shot, shot. This is the story of people who oppose Putin, right? But so Anna Politkovskaya in particular talked about the zombification of Russia. So the problem is, when you say to zombies, I'm sorry, you do realize this isn't in your best interests. The zombies aren't listening because they've been turned into zombies. And so what you've got to do is to get rid of the zombie messiah, Vladimir Putin, and then you have to effectively, for a time, take charge of Russian media and then make it open and responsible, and you set out the evidence of what's happened. And so what I would do is, after Putin falls, you hope there is a different kind of government, and they do proper documentaries where they show what happened in Bucha and Borodanka and Mariupol. By the way, the difference between seeing what happened in Bucha and what happened in Mariupol is that we can go to Bucha because the Ukrainians liberated it. Actually, what happened in Mariupol is far, far worse. It's far darker. But the Russians can't see it. They've made an amazing film. A Ukrainian filmmaker did 20 days in Mariupol. It's an incredibly powerful film. Myself and my friend Kaylin Robertson directed it and shot it. We made a film called The Eastern Front, which you can see through Byline, and it also tells a story. Films like these, and there are many, many more, but films like these can start shining a light into the Russian prison. But at the moment, it feels like it's a prison where there's very, very little light penetrates. And because of that, we have to defeat and destroy the regime that runs the prison first. And then we have to open up the prison, we have to switch on the lights. We have to make sure that the people inside the prison understand that they have been lied to on a monstrous scale, but while being lied to, they have committed monstrous acts. And we have to make sure that the people, just in the same way that we did with the Nazis, that we take them to The Hague and we try them. And we try them for the great war crimes that they have committed here. And I can't bear to think of this. But after the Second World War, we said never again. And now we're saying never again, never again. It's not good enough. We're failing our Ukrainian friends. We need to give them everything they need until this evil is dead.
Well, how can we stop this war? How can we help Ukraine to win this war? How can we get rid of Vladimir Putin, the mastermind of this war, and if it is possible, to create a new Russia which is not a threat anymore to its neighbors? This is all the questions we have discussed today with John Sweeney. He is author of the books Killer in the Kremlin and Putin's Prisoner. He's a person who visited Russia torture chambers in liberated Kherson, who spoke to the survivors, and who is continuing to tell the story of this war of Russia against Ukraine here in Kyiv. Thank you, John.
Thank you.